Okay, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here, back in my home country. The first time I came to CEMA, I was 17 years old. I was a high school student, and I won a scholarship. I had to make a brief presentation in CEMA in front of Carlos Rodriguez and others. I was only 17. I was very nervous. The presentation was very bad. No matter what, I got some prize. I don't know why. But what they told me is that, don't worry, you're only 17 years old. Over time, you're going to improve your presentation skills. 25 years later, that didn't happen. So of the 3 Atlanta Fed presenters, I think that this is going to be probably the weakest point. So what I'm going to do today is, I've been doing some research on these topics, the effect of offshoring automation and low-skill immigration in the US labor market. Essentially, this is like a brief, non-technical summary of 2 papers, one a bit older and now that I'm working right now, almost finished. So let's start with that. Okay. So we see that over the last 35 years, middle-skilled workers in the US have experienced protracted job losses. On the other hand, we've seen that job creation essentially happened at the tails of the skill distribution. That is either low-skilled workers or high-skilled workers. This is what we call labor market polarization, that many people have been studying not only for the US, but also in other advanced economies. So, I told you I was a bad presenter. Okay, so I'm going to start with this graph that I'm going to use later on to show you the polarization of the labor market in just a simple graph. So what we did here is actually, we took 300 occupations in the US, in the census data, in 1980, and we ordered all these occupations by the mean wage in each of these occupations. So here at the bottom, you have occupations with the lowest mean wage, here in the middle, and then here you have occupations with the highest mean wage, high-skill occupations, here in this side. And then what we did is we computed the share of total employment going to each of these occupations. And in the vertical axis, you're actually going to see the change in the share of employment going to these occupations between 1980 and 2010. And we clearly see here that those occupations at the top of the income distribution increase their share in total employment. The same those at the bottom. They also increase their share in the total employment over the last 30 years. But on the other hand, those at the middle, they decline their share. So this is essentially what we call the polarization of the labor market. Okay, I got it now. So why this happens? So why we have a decline in middle-skill employment? So essentially, middle-skill jobs, if you go back 30 years ago, you're going to see that the typical middle-skill occupation or middle class is blue-collar operators in manufacturing or white-collar jobs, essentially administrative workers. And one of the characteristics of these 2 occupations is that they consist on following a daily routine. And the issue here is that these kind of jobs that consist on following a daily routine were severely affected by technological change. And I put you this with a simple example. Let's say the case of a bank teller 30 years ago. To be a bank teller, you need to know some basic math, you need to know accounting, you had to follow rules, you had to put all the transactions running by a bank in different books, etc. So those kind of occupations, being a bank teller, requires some knowledge. So that's the reason why this was a typical middle-class job. But those jobs at the same time were very routine in nature. If you were a bank teller, essentially every day you were doing exactly the same thing over and over again. So when this happens, what you can do is you can break down all these routines in a smaller and smaller tasks in a very well-defined set of procedures, and eventually you can code these tasks and replace them by computers and robots. And that's the reason why the typical bank teller was replaced by an ATM machine over the last 3 decades. In manufacturing, the same. You have many operators doing routine work that over time they were replaced by robots. That's the reason why technology plays a big role in affecting negatively the performance of middle-skill occupations. But in addition to automation, offshoring was an important factor. Why? Because if you're doing a routine, what you can do, thanks to the advancements in telecommunications and the decline in trade costs, you can have someone in China doing the same routine. You can monitor this worker because communications are cheap, and the trade cost is also declining. So it's easy to offshore this routine labor to other countries in the world. So that's the reason why you see that operators, jobs move to China, and consumer and administrative support likely move to India. Nowadays, if you have a problem with your computer, you make a phone call, and not surprisingly, you're going to be answered by someone in India. So the question is, why other workers were not affected? Let's start first with the high-skill occupations. High-skill occupations typically require 2 things. One is creativity, and the other one is interaction with human beings. So here I put some examples: managers, programmers, product designers, that is, you are in the designing a new product, or research and development. So these are occupations that either require creativity. This is not a routine job that you can ask a computer to do it. Or if you're a manager, you have to deal with human beings. That means that these type of skills are different than routine. We call these cognitive skills. And in general, at least historically, were very hard to automate. I will say for now. The rest of the presentation, I'm going to say that this is changing as well. So automation was not very profound in high-skilled jobs over the last 3 decades. What about offshoring? In principle, many of the high-skilled jobs, for instance, in research and development, product design, can be executed overseas. But I will say that the US at least had a comparative advantage in these type of occupations. So to put an example, nothing prevents all the people from Silicon Valley to relocate overseas. But I will say that it will be hard to find the unique type of human capital you're going to find in Silicon Valley somewhere else in the world. That's the reason why, even though offshoring is possible for many of these occupations, the US had historically a comparative advantage on that. So automation is not possible. These are cognitive skills, human relationships, and offshoring, even though it's possible, the US specializes in high-skill occupations. But I told you, okay, middle-skill occupations going down, high-skill not affected by these 2 phenomena. What happened with the low-skill jobs, those who are at the bottom of the skill distribution? Okay. We also see low-skill jobs, and what we argue in the research, so first of all, what are the typical low-skill occupations in the US? Essentially, we find people doing service or manual jobs, the so-called service occupations. These are some examples: janitors, nannies, people cleaning your house, home health aides, taking care of old people, gardeners, construction laborers, very simple construction work. So the issue is that automation is also not very feasible for low-skill occupations. Why? Because if you are a gardener or a construction laborer, this is essentially manual jobs. It requires manual handling. At least for now, it's very difficult to automate this with a robot. And on the other, if you are a nanny and you take care of babies, you have to deal with completely unpredictable human beings. And there is nothing more unpredictable than my kids. So I can tell you that not even in 2,000 years, you are going to find a robot that can predict what my kids are going to do. So the fact that the nanny, the babysitter had to deal with babies that are highly unpredictable, that means that you cannot automate these jobs. There is no way you can replace this with computers and robots. So what about offshoring? Just look at the examples that I mentioned before. So I would love to hire a babysitter from the Philippines. They say they are very good and very cheap in Manila. But unfortunately, all these type of occupations, the examples look again at the top, are essentially non-tradable jobs. There is no way you can offshore, you can outsource a nanny or a gardener or a construction worker. So that's the reason why not only they are protected from automation, but also they are protected from the offshoring way. That's the reason why only those at the middle were affected by this. But you cannot offshore a nanny, but what you can do in principle is to bring immigrants into the country. And effectively, we see that in the US, in the last 30 years, the foreign-born population increased significantly. And a disproportionate number of these immigrants were relatively low skilled. Here you have an example. Foreign-born job creation, and we see that foreign-born job creation mostly occur in the low skill segment, while on the other hand, natives have their job creation mostly in the high skill segment. So I want you to remember the figure that I showed at the beginning. What we do in this figure is we split up between natives in the US and foreign-born. So remember that at the beginning I showed you like a polarization, like a U shape. Here in the dotted line, you have the same curve, but only considering people that was born in the United States. So notice that job creation that you have here at the bottom, I don't know if you remember the first picture, disappear. Essentially, the job creation for the natives happened among the high-skilled workers. On the other hand, when you just focus on the foreign-born, this is the green line here, you see that the vast majority of the job creation for the foreign-born in the US happened in these low-skilled, non-tradable service occupations. So the idea, we could say, is that those jobs are non-tradable. They are manual, that cannot be replaced by machines, but immigrants in principle can do the job. So what happens when we look at wages? So far I showed you employment. So what we do now is showing exactly the same figure. So this is the same ordering that I mentioned before, but instead of plotting employment, here we plot a change in real wages in the last 30 years. So, and this is for all the workers in the US. So you remember that, again, going back to the first figure I showed you when I started this presentation, this was like a U shape. With some creativity, this is more like a J than a U. And you see that for those that are at the bottom of the skill distribution, even though they observed employment gains, wages didn't grow as fast. So we say that there is an asymmetry here. We see that for the high skill, wages increase the same as employment. For the middle skilled, employment was very bad, but real wage growth was also very depressed. So essentially there was a symmetry. But for the low skill, essentially we had that wages did not match the strong increase in low skill, in demand for low skill occupations. So the question that we're going to explore next is whether the increase in immigration, the supply of new low skill workers, contributed to the deflationary pressures on workers that are relatively low skilled. And finally, another thing that we want to put in the model is this distinction between two ways of automation. So essentially, we see that starting in the 80s, we had a lot of advancements in equipment technology. Essentially, there was a big decline in the price of computers and robots. And those advances was essentially broadly implemented in the US economy in the 90s. And these innovations affected middle-skilled workers. So essentially, all the information I showed you in the past was essentially automation affecting these middle-skilled workers, essentially equipment technology. However, starting in the 1990s, we've seen that there was a different change in information technology. Rather than advancements in equipment technology, we have advancements in advanced software. And this is only being implemented late in the 2000s. So this is actually something very new that we've seen in the data. So essentially, these advanced software are innovations that are not affecting much the middle-skilled workers who I showed before, but instead are affecting more the high-skilled occupations. And on top of that, what we're seeing right now is developments in artificial intelligence that can also dent into higher employment. So I will show you a figure that is not mine, which is copied from a recent paper. So once again, I'm going to do the same ordering of occupations I keep doing the whole presentation. Ordering occupations by mean wage. Here, this is essentially a different year, but nothing much changes. So on the blue, you are going to have the equipment in use, and on the red, you are going to have the routine share by each of these occupations ranked by the mean wage. So clearly see that in equipment, computers and robots, the equipment use is most in the middle of the skill distribution. It peaks essentially here at the middle. And this coincides, of course, with the routine share. But for software, that we've seen much of the advancement in the last few years is the opposite. We see that software is more important, software used for high-skilled workers that have essentially cognitive abilities. So in simple words, we see that before it was machines replacing administrative workers, what we are seeing nowadays is that the advanced software has been, we've seen amazing developments in advanced software, that this software actually can replace some programmers, some engineers that were needed before, but many of them are not needed now. So we also wanted to include that in the model. So this could explain, so the emergence of advanced software and how this is affecting high-skill employment can explain this trend. So here what I show, this is per capita employment. This is employment over population 16 years in high-skill occupations or cognitive occupations. So we see that there was a secular increase in trend for many years that actually resisted the recessions of 1991 to 1992. But then after the year 2002, high-skill employment essentially flattened out. And some economists call this phenomenon a skill reversal, that we are no longer demanding high-skilled workers. Why? Because we have software that can replace some of these workers. Well, this is a pattern for middle-skill employment, and middle-skill employment has been going down for many years. This is actually very big. If you take the year 1990 to 2009, essentially 30% decline in middle-skill employment. For low-skilled, it was growing. It increased a lot during the boom. This is probably related with the construction boom and then decline in the recession, in the Great Recession, but still the trend is positive. I have a problem with this. I don't know. I don't have the right cognitive ability to move. So we have a new paper that we're almost finished with that, where essentially we want to put all this automation, immigration, and offshoring and trying to explain how much it affected different skill groups in terms of employment. And then try to get how much is affecting the well-being of the typical or average US household in the US. So this is the data a bit, just to give you an idea. So this is data and automations. Essentially what you have here in red is the relative price compared to regular average consumption of information communication technology and capital, and the blue one is just the average price of regular capital, non-ICT capital. And we see that starting in 1983, essentially this price decreased from essentially 1, this is a numerator, to 0.2. It's essentially like it was decreased the price of communications or information technology by 4/5. And not surprisingly, the stock of ICT increased by a factor of 7 or 10, more or less. So big increase in investment in communications, as advanced software, robots, etc. But the other hand, the puzzle is that still, when you take at the whole economy as a whole, the share of income going to this information communication technology capital is still relatively small. I'm going to go over this point later on in my presentation. Still, much of the capital gains go to a traditional capital that we understand, not the technological capital. And well, this is offshoring data. Not surprisingly, offshoring has increased a lot. The trade cost has been decreased a lot, and also the US economy became much more open. When you take here, this is export plus imports divided GDP, there was essentially 80, 90% increase in how much the US trades with the rest of the world. So the good thing, I don't have to show you the math, the model, that's very boring. You have to believe me that the model is good, unfortunately, but believe me that it's a reasonable model. So what I'm going to do is summarize the model results and tell you, okay, what is the effect of offshoring? What is the effect of automation? And what is the effect of low-skill immigration over the last 30 years for the typical or average native US household that we have in this economy? Well, let's first go to offshoring, or what people call here the globalization of the economy. Well, how this affected the typical US household. So here we're going to abstract completely from income distribution. We know that globalization has been very bad for middle-skilled workers. That's why I showed you at the beginning. That's why we have the polarization. But let's assume that workers can use transfers to distribute the gains from globalization between them. So that's the assumption that we're going to have in this paper. So in general, we say that offshoring, globalization clearly benefit the high-skilled. Why? Because globalization means that it's an expanding demand for high-skilled workers and cheaper intermediates. And to put a very simple example, the iPhone now is being designed in the US. The iPhone can be very cheaply assembled in China. And best of the world, you can sell the design of the iPhone not only in the US, but worldwide. So this is very good for those that are designing the iPhone 11 or iPhone 12. There is going to be an increasing demand overseas, and also it's going to be cheaply produced. On the other hand, this is going to displace middle-skilled workers, but it's also going to benefit the lower skill. Why? Because the high skill essentially are going to do well off thanks to this globalization. So those iPhone designers in Silicon Valley, they're going to go more often to the restaurant, they're going to buy bigger houses. That means if they go more often to a restaurant, they will need to hire nannies or babysitters to take care of their kids. If they go to a restaurant, they will hire waiters. If they have a bigger house, they will need gardeners, construction laborers that are going to be used to construct those houses. So essentially, the lowest skilled are going to benefit from these productivity gains associated with globalization. So what is the net picture? And this is what I call welfare gains. So overall, when we do all the computations, we see that clearly offshoring is good for the US economy. Why? Because essentially this is traditional comparative advantage analysis from International Trade 101. The US is going to specialize in high-skilled tasks where it's relatively more efficient. The US is relatively more efficient in designing the iPhone. On the other hand, these gains are going to be offset by middle skill downgrading and moving to less productive service jobs. So essentially, you have middle skills that they were before working in manufacturing. Manufacturing usually is a more productive work, and now they're going to go to Walmart. Walmart productivity, labor productivity in Walmart is relatively lower. So you have this contracting effect. Very good for the high skill, much more productivity gains, but then the middle skill are going to downgrade their skills, they're going to get less to school, and also they're going to move to less productive jobs. What about immigration? This is probably the most controversial. Actually, this is even controversial now in Argentina, I noticed this morning. Well, essentially, that's why I said before, low-skill immigration supports employed in services that I said before were non-tradable by definition. So what is the net picture that we get out of immigration? Well, we have, again, welfare gains for the average household. So why is that? First of all, there is a negative impact on immigration in the sense that immigrants are going to effectively depress low-skilled wages. However, by keeping low-skilled wages low, that means that the price of services is going to be also low. So going to a restaurant is going to be cheap, or hiring a babysitter is also going to be cheap. So indirectly, this increases the competitiveness of the US workers. So just to put a bit of technicality here is that we're going to see that the price of the non-tradables are going to go down. And we know that in a real model, whenever the price of non-tradables go down, that means that the real exchange rate depreciates. So essentially, indirectly, this is going to be a gain that is going to improve the competitiveness of the typical US worker. Just to give you, this is very technical, so I want to give you a very simple take from that. The idea is that, what do I say with that, with this real exchange rate depreciation or decreasing the price of non-tradables? This is what some people call upskilling. That's not an English word, but I've seen this word. So the idea is that by having immigrants doing the less productive jobs, natives can move to do more productive labor. And put the example of a professional woman that needs to take care of their kids. If you have immigrants that are willing to provide cheaper child care, so then for these professional women, probably it's going to be affordable to go to the labor market where they can do something more productive. If for some reason, child care that is usually provided by immigrants is very expensive because the immigrants are not here, then it could be what happens in countries like Japan in the 90s, where women are forced to be at home taking care of the kids. And professional women, maybe they have fun or not of taking care of kids, but this is not very productive for the whole economy. So the reason why we say that immigrants allow the natives to upskill, to move to occupations that are relatively more productive. And then, related to that, is that immigrants, and there is also some micro evidence, there is a lot of micro studies that are studying this issue, is that enhances training among the natives. Why? Because the idea is that if you have a lot of low-skilled immigrants coming into the country, you don't want to be a taxi driver. Why? Because a taxi driver is a job that any low-skilled immigrant can do. So if you want to differentiate yourself from the immigrants, the only option that you have, if you are a native, is to go to school, to get more training, to differentiate yourself. And by doing so, that increases productivity. So anyway, we don't have time to go over that. And finally, what happens with automation? And this is quite interesting as well. Not surprisingly, overall, the economy benefits from automation. Why? Because automation increases productivity, and by increasing productivity, increases aggregate income. But we see that what happens with employment? In the quantitative analysis, we have that, what we showed you before. First, middle-skilled workers are replaced in large numbers. So the first thing that automation does in the model is to get rid of the assemblers and the office workers that are replaced by robots and computers. But then, this is something I'm going to show you next. At the end of the sample, in the last year, the high-skilled workers follow. That is, those programmers are being replaced by advanced software or accountants that probably were professional also, but the fact that softwares in accounting improve so much, many of them are being replaced by these more advanced more advanced software that do problem solver. Particularly, you have that the middle skill are severely affected by automation, the high skill are coming next, but still for now, and this is what we get from the literature, those who are working in services that have to deal with humans or they're doing manual jobs, they are still protected from automation. So automation is very good, essentially, for the lowest skilled. So a further discussion I want to make on this is that when I was doing this paper with Andre, one of the things, we got the data, we had the model, and we found that automation had very, very tiny effects on employment. The effects of automation on what happens with employment in the US economy is very small. And the reason why is that even though automation ICT capital is growing very rapidly, the share of income going to ICT capital is still less than 5% of GDP. So this is a big puzzle. Fortunately, I was running the codes, looking at the data. I was a bit worried that probably I made a typo in the code or the data was not right, but this is something that is coming also in the literature. There are well-known people like Asemoglu or Haimovich that they say, yes, everyone is talking about automation and how this is killing jobs, but with the models and with data we have available, you're not going to find any effects of automation on employment that are important. So the next question is probably we're doing something, we have to change their models. We have the way to how we measure automation in this economy. So this is something that requires more future research. But the interesting thing, this is a general audience, so I wanted to give you some take on what if there are students here, what they should do next, is that what we've seen, and actually this is very frequent data, this is a very nice paper by also Cortesio and Jaimovich, that social skills and creativity are becoming the skills for the future. If you are a very good engineer and you are very good at programming and you are very proud of that, what this presentation is telling you is that you have to be very worried. Artificial intelligence and software that is advanced and it's been improving a lot can replace you as well. So, but on the other hand, if you are very good at dealing with people, at giving presentations, not I mean, or being creative, or doing manual stuff, dealing with human beings, then it seems to be that the future of employment seems to go in that direction. So that's why I was showing you before. So I wanted to show you. So in green, this is little green is the effect of automation in middle skill employment. So you see that. So here we see that from 1983 to 2013, in blue is the effect of offshoring in middle skill employment. In green is the effect of automation. So offshoring, apparently, the data tells you that was far much more important in explaining the decline in middle skill employment than automation. For high skill, it's a negligible effect, but if you look at the last 5-7 years, automation starts to affect negatively also high skill employment that we had here. But the blue line is the decrease in offshoring costs. And we see that the decrease in offshoring costs, as I showed you before, was essentially very beneficial for the middle and high was very beneficial for the high skill workers. On the other hand, when we look at a low skill employment, in red, we have immigration. Much of the increase in low skill employment is since 1983 is explained by immigration. And this is related to the graph that I showed you before, how immigrants explain much of the increase in low skill and immigration. And but on the other hand, we see that immigrants, this is wages, the fact that immigrants came affected very negatively low skilled workers. So this is zero, this is a negative impact on wages of the low skilled. And on the other hand, helped both the middle skill and the high skill. Why? Because they provide cheap services and they allowed for workers to do more effective labor. So that's what I wanted to say. I think that I'm running out of time. So maybe you have questions for Steve. I don't know why you left. Or question for me. You're welcome. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Did you study the nature of the people who went outside the working market?
So who is what do you mean, like home production or?
No, I mean people quit work looking for work.
So yes, the information that we use in employment to measure the success of the model is employment per capita. So we consider people that is actually in the labor force or out of the labor force. Because what happened is that many middle skilled workers drop out completely from the labor force. Mm-hmm. So they are not showing up in the statistics as unemployed workers. So that's the reason why in the quantitative analysis and the figures that I showed before, we take employment over population 16 years or older to take into account that. But I'm not sure whether that was your question.
No.
I just asked you before.
Almost.
Yes.
But what I would like to know is, has there been a displacement of American work because of the foreigners going to the States?
You're talking about low-skilled workers?
Yes.
Yes, we find that in the model, well, at least, the statistics that I showed before is that if you look at, even though there was a big creation in low-skilled employment, that creation of low-skilled jobs was essentially explained by immigrants coming in. When you take out the immigrants, there is no job creation in low-skilled occupations. But that doesn't mean that they're unemployed. Very likely they upgrade, they have skillings, they could move to middle-skilled occupations like with more responsibilities. Yeah, or they can go out of the labor force. We also allow for that, yeah. That's the thing that, yeah.
First, congratulations for the paper. I think it's very interesting research.
Thank you.
Couple of questions. First, are you looking ONET data to do the analysis, which is databases? Second, when you look at the effects of automation on employment, are you looking at occupation or tasks?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're looking at occupations, no? That's what we do in the model. I mean, that's a very good question. In the model, technically, these are labor tasks, but when we move when we made the mapping from the model to the data, it's hard to get tasks in the data, so we link that with occupations, essentially. But the data at least is occupational, is employment per capita. Yeah. And the first question, sorry, I missed it.
What is which data are you using as the basis? Are you using the ONET database?
No, we are not using that.
You're not using.
So we are using for employment. We're grouping occupations based on a classification done originally by Haimovich and Siu, where we can group occupations based on the different tasks that they do, where they're routine, cognitive, or manual. We group these occupations in three big baskets. So essentially, this is the way we measure employment. And then we have data on automation. This is data on what I showed before, and also proxies for trade cost, offshoring, etc. So we put that together. But we don't look at the ONET data. However, there is plenty of research that shows that the grouping of occupations that make is highly consistent with the ONET data. This is a paper by Autor and Dorn that they show that they translate exactly very well. So that our data analysis is very much consistent with the ONET classification.
Thank you.
Very good questions.
I have just one short question. When you look at this data and you look at demographics and population trends, do you see, as you make some projections, that we could see a downward trend in the overall population of the US? Because obviously there is numbers behind these qualitative conclusions. And so you have more people obviously employed in labor-intensive industries and others that are more capital-intensive or perhaps even technology-intensive that do not require so many workers. Have you sort of come across any clear signals about depopulation in certain geographical areas or reversal of population growth in some other areas?
So essentially where you see some areas, for instance, where you have manufacturing, like the Rust Belt, you have population decline. That was a question, or? Yes, yeah, we clearly see. We didn't do that analysis here, regional. But clearly, some areas, there is a paper by also Autor and Hanson where they show that that offshoring was particularly bad for some regions in the Midwest, not Midwest of the US. But I'm not sure that was your question.
So my question was actually, in the aggregate.
Yes.
Because of the nature of the industries that are actually demanding some of these high or low skilled workers, are they actually able to offset the decline in demand in the middle? Or actually, when you look at that, the end result is that we will see a population decline in the US as a result of this?
No, in general, we see that if you look at aggregate number of employment, they are growing up. But it's true that you had, demographic factors. Labor force participation has been dropping. because of the aging of the baby boomers. So when you see that how many workers are in the labor force, there is a decline. So you had, overall employment of our population has been declining. So the decrease in middle skill probably was not enough. I mean, the increases in the tails were not enough to compensate by the decrease in employment in the middle. But that doesn't mean because of the economy. I think it's more because of the demographic factor. That naturally, as the population ages and you have many people dropping off the labor force, particularly baby boomers, you are going to have naturally that employment is going to decline. But yes, that will be the explanation. No?
May I ask two questions? One is if your model can be extended to the analysis of race, which might be very relevant in the United States. And second, if you have measured the impact in macroeconomic impact, if the propension to spend is different from what you might assume, say, if the beneficiaries of these tendencies have a lower tendency to spend and a higher tendency to save money.
So it is that, for instance, those that own the capital, ICT capital, they're not going to spend as much. No, we're not exploring that in that paper. So we don't allow for heterogeneous different saving rates. I think that probably that so will be something that will be interesting to study. I'm not sure whether that will affect the results, but there is something I didn't do, so I don't want to say about something that we do, but might be interesting for future research.
This, if the model is correct, and we're assuming that it is, we are economists, this should have lots of implications in terms of inflation, especially if immigration is limited at the low skill level. That means that those positions, those nannies, carpenters, construction workers, salaries should start to go up. Have you looked at that?
Well, we look at the wages. That is a product. That is more about the labor market. And in the case of services, since these are labor intensive, wages and price of services are highly correlated. We didn't look at the overall inflation picture, and which is more like a real model. It's more like about relative prices. But yeah, I mean, it's clearly that this model has implications about, in principle, I mean, assuming different assumptions of the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, how people form their expectations, etc. This can have some effects as well. But strictly speaking, we are structuring, even though I work at the Fed, we are structured completely from monetary policy, and this is a real model. And essentially, it's more like our relative prices, and that's it.
Well, thank you, Federico, for
Thank you very much.
sharing this research with us. Very interesting.